So, today's lecture, we're going to be talking about fortune telling. So, specifically, we're going to be looking at how people from the past tried looking into the future. And while some might see this as a rather frivolous topic, it gives us a really interesting glimpse into what was important to people at the time. What were they going to see fortune tellers for? You know, what kinds of questions were they asking? What methods were they using to divine the answers? So this is, my background is in anthropology. And so, yes, anthropology. So that's kind of how I see this. I see this as an interesting way of learning about people. Because I found that with topics like this, people can tend to expose themselves a little bit, make themselves a little more vulnerable than they might otherwise be, and so we can learn a lot from that. So we're going to look at kind of the who, what, where, why, when of fortune telling in late 18th and early 19th century America. So this is kind of a bit of a lull in research on this topic. I found one of the problems with researching this particular time period is that there's a lot of material on witchcraft, especially from the 1700s. The 17th century. There's a lot of information about the Victorian occult and spiritualism period. And then there's this bit in the middle where there's just not as much material on it. However, I have been able to find some, and I'm happy to share with you what I've learned. So the two objects that are in the DAR Museum collection that we have over here on the cart here, if you want to check them out later in person, they date to that time period, the sort of 18th and early 19th century in America. And so I'll briefly introduce you to the two objects, and then we'll take a look at the cultural context surrounding them. So the first is a teapot. This was made in England sometime after 1778, because that's the date that's on the teapot. And it says made according to the Act, 4th of January 1778. I have not been able to find any act of parliament that corresponds to that date. If anybody finds one, please tell me, because I've been searching. So it was made in England, but used here in America. It's not the only one in existence. There's one in the British Museum collection. There's at least one in another American collection. So it wasn't like a particularly unique object. There's a few around. It wasn't the only one of its kind. So specifically, what's on it? This side on the right here shows an astrologer, and he is giving some horoscopes. He's doing up a horoscope and telling the fortunes of two women. And we'll take a closer look there. There's some fun imagery going on in there. And then the other side of it that's a horoscope. The square pattern there is a horoscope, and then behind it are the Copernican and Ptolemaic views of the universe, those the round bits. You'll be able to see that closer up in person. So one thing that's kind of interesting about this imagery here is it's actually making fun of astrologers. It's showing this astrologer fellow as being way wealthier than astrologers actually would have been. He's got like stacks of money on his table. There's some creepy guy sitting, crouching behind his chair. You can't actually figure out exactly what he's doing there, but it looks odd. And then the contrast between the Copernican and Ptolemaic views of the universe here is also deliberate. If you need a little refresher course, if it's been a little while since you had that particular class in school. So the old view of the world was that the Earth was the center of the universe, and the sun and all the planets and stars revolved around the Earth. And then that shifted to the Copernican view of the universe, the solar system, in which the sun is the center and everything revolves around the sun. So the fact that they're putting both in there seems to be suggesting that they think this whole relying on planets and stars thing is a bunch of hooey. So this is rather anti-occult, kind of poking fun at it. Contrast that here with the Book of Fate, which we have a copy of over there. And so this was published in the 1830s. Couldn't tell you the exact date of this copy because the title page isn't in there, but other copies were printed in the 1830s. In Boston, which, if you'll recall, is in the state of Massachusetts, which is also home to Salem. What a difference 150 odd years makes. So it's that is an interesting shift, and we'll talk about that a little bit later also. Has nobody gotten to the end of the title yet then? I honestly don't know why these titles always go on forever. Anyway, now this is, if you were to Google the Book of Fate, you will turn up a totally different book, also with the same name. This is the Book of Fate, formerly in the possession of Napoleon, published in 1822. It is also a fortune-telling book, but it is not the same one. It has a totally different method in there. That one's, Napoleon's book, is easy to find online. This one, I've never been able to find a digitized copy of it. So, this, as opposed to the Teapot, which was kind of making fun of the occult, the book here is rather takes the DIY option. No, you don't have to go to somebody. You can just use this book and learn how to do it yourself. And so it supports a very positive view of the subject. So, moving on to the cultural context here that these objects existed in. So, where these were used, in the case of the book, it was printed, and both of them were used in the eastern part of the United States, which then, I just have a few other circles there to illustrate that this was not the only occult tradition around at the time, that there were people from Africa had brought their traditions, people from other parts of Europe had traditions that were actually quite different from the English. So both of these books are descended from the English tradition of fortune-telling, which then also contrasted with the Native American traditions as well. So that's specifically what we have here. We have something from the English tradition that's being used here, but it's side by side with this mingling of a lot of other traditions as well, and they did tend to sort of influence each other. So the question, one of the questions that we have here is who's doing it? Who's doing this fortune telling? So we saw a picture of an astrologer on the teapot. I pulled some other images from various woodcuts and engravings. So let's do a little spot the similarities here. So how would you describe the people in these engravings? What demographics would you put them in? What words would you use to describe them? Wealthy, all right. Men, yes, they're all men. How about anything about their surroundings strike you? The globe, yeah, there's always a globe. They have a lot of accoutrement. Yes, the stars and planets, yes, absolutely. Yes, so astrologers were coming out of a tradition in Europe that was performed pretty much just by men, and these were learned and educated men as well. This tradition, there was a lot of study involved, and you had to spend a lot of time learning about it. It was very, very complicated, and they were seen as professionals then. Now in America, there wasn't. It wasn't quite to the, like, you couldn't go to university, for example, to be an astrologer that I'm aware of. But there still were men who were claiming to work as astrologers here in America. For example, a 1795 advertisement in Massachusetts said that John Francis respectfully informs the public that he would thank them kindly not to call on him after this public notice for any explanations in astronomy, physiognomy, etc., commonly called fortune-telling, as he has now engaged himself in a line of mercantile business that will require his whole attention. So he's getting himself out of that particular business, John Francis was a member of the free black community in that town of Massachusetts. And unusually for fortune tellers at the time, he was an established member of the community. He wasn't an itinerant or traveler. So how were they doing this here? Now, somebody noted the planets. So there are a lot of planets and stars feature heavily into imagery. Yes. Yeah, these are earlier than the time of the Teapot. Yes. Yeah. So it's a very complicated business, and hence you see they were surrounded by all of these tools. So he's got a whole pile of them under his table here. Someone mentioned the globe. Now that's probably a celestial globe. Globes tended to come in pairs. We have some in the museum here. So there's the terrestrial globe that we're all familiar with that shows the continents. And then there's the celestial globe that shows the constellation. When working as an astrologer, it makes a lot more sense for that to be a celestial globe, although you can't really see that level of detail in this engraving. Then the book kind of under the globe is an ephemeris, most likely, which it's a book. It lists the locations of the stars and planets at a particular hour at every hour of every day. So you would need, if you need to calculate somebody's horoscope, you need the time, not just the day, but also the time that they were born. And then under the book is this wheel-looking thing, probably an astrolabe, which is a tool for calculating the location of a star. You do need an unobstructed view of the horizon, so it would not work in, say, the middle of New York City. But shipboard, you're fine. And then, so what are you doing with all of these tools? You are calculating somebody's horoscope. And so this is a picture. Apparently modern horoscopes are now made to be round, but the older ones were squares. And so what you need is, you need to know when someone was born. And to quote somebody in the Virginia Gazette from 1772, you need the year, the month, the day, the hour, nay, the exact minute when he was born. And then you will look it up in your ephemeris, and then you can calculate where all the stars and planets were at the exact minute of your birth, and that will tell a lot of things about you. So the stars and planets feature heavily. This may be somewhat familiar to you then. So this image in particular shows up in just about every almanac of the period, and it's reliant on the signs of the zodiac. So specifically the 12 signs that most people, I think, are at least generally aware of what their sun sign is. For example, what are we in now? Taurus. Do we have any Taurus in the room? Oh, there's a Taurus. All right. Oh, a couple of them. All right. Yeah. So you're familiar with this concept already. But the thing about astrology is that if you're really doing your horoscope properly, you're not just looking at your sun sign. You're looking at where everything else was also, and that has an effect. So an astrologer would say that, well, if you read the horoscope for Taurus and you think, that doesn't really sound like me, well, that's because it's only one element. There's a whole lot more there. So this illustration actually is from that book, the Book of Fate that we have. So it's a nice segue into the other kind of fortune telling. So these two objects. Not only are they completely different types of objects, but they also represent kind of the two main branches of fortune telling at the time. So astrology was the one, and then the other branch there's not a particularly overall term for it. We can just call it fortune telling, but as you saw, they called astrology that also. But this second branch here would encompass palmistry, card reading, kind of, I think, more what people think of now when they think, if you say, oh, I just had my fortune told, someone would probably assume that you went to someone to have your palm read, or they read tarot cards. So that's the second branch of fortune telling. So let's play the same game. Who's doing this kind of fortune telling? Give me some magic. What was that? Women? Yes. Old women, yes. They look like witches. Yes. They fortune telling women tended to be portrayed as old, ugly, and ragged. And which we'll get to whether or not that was, whether there was some truth in that. But yes, that's very common imagery for a female fortune teller, is to be, sometimes they're young, but usually they're shown very ragged and in many cases old and unpleasant looking. There were some, now there were actually some men who were doing this type of fortune telling also. So like on the left here, we have a gentleman who's reading her, or excuse me, not a gentleman, a man reading her palm. And on the right, then there's a man who's getting his fortune told. But generally it was women who were doing this type. Now, one difference also is that they were not really seen as professionals, or at least not in the way of like formal schooling. So they were not formally trained. They were relying, on personal talents and on practice rather than any sort of schooling. Now, one of the things that so these images are all from Europe. This is the first American image I've been able to find of a fortune teller. So this is from 1838. Now, one of the things that these images do not indicate is the racial diversity of fortune tellers at this time. I know of one study that discovered that before 1850 in New England, almost half of the known fortune tellers were African, Native, or of mixed ancestry. So it was a lot more diverse than the images here would suggest. Now they did tend to be people who were pushed towards the margins of society. So widows, the destitute, people of mixed race, marginalized individuals. So there is some amount of truth of the whole imagery of these women being very ragged. It wasn't always the case, but they did tend to be marginalized individuals, yes. So one question that does come up also, especially if you think that a lot of this is happening in New England, is it legal? Technically, no, at this time, but it's also technically not legal in Pennsylvania now, and you can still go get your fortune told there. So while colonial laws made witchcraft and fortune telling, etc., a crime punishable by death, everyone thinks of Salem. After independence, every state could decide separately, and that's still the case now. However, many states adopted a similar law to Britain's updated law, in which it made the practice illegal, but you were punished more as like a con artist than as someone in league with Satan. So, you'd get a fine, you'd go to jail, but it wasn't like people didn't think you were in league with the devil. So the conviction and punishment of this was fairly erratic. People definitely still did it. There were books both published in America and imported. Starting in the 1700s, going right up till now. And so we also know from written records that people practice this not just for themselves. So that I guess the idea with the book is, you get this book and you learn how to do it yourself. Well, we do know from other records that people were going to professionals to have their fortunes read. So, for example, in 1746 in Salem Village, a woman moved to the area as a fortune teller. And we know this because the church publicly testified to its abhorrence of anyone who visited her. And then, that's about 50 years after the Salem witch trials. So there were people alive then who remembered that. And at this point, the church is saying, no, we don't like this, but at least no one's going around and hanging anybody. 50 years after that, then, in 1799, there was, also in Salem, I have a lot of information from that part of the world, there was a funeral of an African woman who was, quote, long celebrated as a fortune teller, having received ample encouragement from the local community. So, again, technically it's illegal, but it's clearly still going on. And then I love this one. So in April of 1800, the Philadelphia Gazette published an article by a very cranky individual who complained about how this fortune teller has set this woman has set up shop as a fortune teller. I have been led to these general remarks by an unaccountable infatuation or enchantment, which appears to be practiced upon the inhabitants of the city, and particularly upon unmarried ladies, by one of these female magicians, who is said to have opened a commerce with other worlds in a certain magic cell in Race Street. He goes on at some length about this. It's pretty hilarious. He's really not happy about this, and goes on and on about how he just can't believe that people would be this gullible. And I mean, you thought internet rants today were bad. You should read this guy's article. So in the late 18th century, as that article indicates, we also see an increase in the number of people just recording casually in their diaries that they went to visit a fortune teller. You know, went to Boston, bought some fabric, had my fortune told, came home. And just the tone of these being just as if it were no big deal, like, oh yeah, made butter, had fortune told. So it's clearly becoming not as big a deal, even though still technically illegal. So that was the who of who's doing it. So then let's look at who's going to have their fortunes told. And that Philadelphia article did hint at who the most common customers were, which is young unmarried women. And so you can see here, these are the two ladies on our teapot. This one, the one on the right here, is being handed her fortune that says a husband. And the one on the left, she looks kind of smug, I think. Then the one on the left here is she's looking very sad because hers says never married. Oh, poor thing. Yeah. So the assumption at the time is that it's mostly women going to these fortune tellers, although as we saw earlier, men did too. It was also all classes. So that same grumpy article from the Philadelphia Gazette described the clients as, quote, a congested throng of specters, sprites, ostlers, ladies, waiting maids, and statesmen. Oh my, good heavens. So when these people went to a fortune teller, what happened? What did they do? So there were a number of different methods, and all of these are listed in the Book of Fate. They each have a different chapter. What am I doing here? Oh, there we are. So the upper left one shows somebody dreaming. So dream interpretation was one method of fortune telling, and for that you would say you wake up and you had this weird dream where like you went up a tree to rescue a kitten, but instead you ate an apple and then you fell out of the tree. So you'd wake up in the morning and go, oh, that was weird. That must have meant something. So then you have to figure out what the main subject was of your dream, and then all the interpretations in the book are helpfully listed alphabetically by one-word subject. So you go, okay, was it more about the apple that I ate, or the falling, or was it the cat? So, and to be safe, you could check all of them. So that's how you get your dream interpreted. Another one, cards. Now, I mentioned tarot cards earlier. That's generally what people think of when they think of having cards read. But predating tarot cards were playing cards, at least as far as fortune telling is concerned. Tarot cards were around, but they were used it was a game. It was a card game until late 18th century, but mostly in the 19th century then, when people started using them, tarot cards as a fortune-telling device, and then that quickly overtook playing cards in popularity. But that's why in these illustrations you see these are just regular, hearts, diamonds, spades, etc. They're also and if you want to see some original playing cards, we have some in a couple of our period rooms in the museum. The New York room and the Kentucky room, I believe, has a deck also. they're interesting. So they just have the pips on them. There's no helpful number in the corner, so you have to get really good at counting the pips, which makes it difficult when you're playing them, I found, because you usually have just the number showing. Well, you can't do that when there's no number. You also have to get really good at identifying the difference between a knave and a king, knave being what they called a jack, because they're similar. So the way this worked is it's kind of similar to what people know of tarot today. So that each card had a meaning, and so the cards that you drew or laid out determined what your fortune was. Now, it was actually a little more complicated than that, because each card, depending on which method you went with, sometimes the cards had multiple meanings depending on what they were next to. So it gets to be very complicated quickly, and you need to retain a lot in your memory. Another method that you might try is reading the dregs of what beverage? Aha! Tea was generally not used until the 19th century. Coffee dregs are what you're reading here. So I've, in all of the written books, and this book included, they talk about reading coffee dregs, coffee, and then in an 1863 book is the earliest I've been able to find where it starts saying coffee and tea, and then that eventually morphs into just tea. So the caption for this engraving, I'll read it because it's hilarious, and it's going to sound a little familiar too. So the one on the left says, "Here's luck in the bottom, dear Jane, only see, my dream and my coffee in a wedding agree." You can see the young man standing behind her, just ready to pop the question. And then on the right, the lady who's looking a little sad, she says, "But my dear sister, what fate me befall, I fear I can wait for no wedding at all." Which brings to mind that image. Again, a very common question that was asked. So then the last sort of major branch of this type of fortune telling is physiognomy. Oh, sorry, that's right. I was going to, I had a couple more that I love this one of because it actually shows her pouring the coffee, as well as looking at the grounds. All right, there we are. So the last major branch is physiognomy, which is reading the features on your body to tell about yourself and about your potential future. Most well known of that being palm reading, but you could also read wrinkles, your general appearance, how big your nose was, moles. In fact, mole reading is a very common one in books like this. And in case you came here hoping to have your fortune told, I'm going to do it right now. So, moles are fairly common in people of English descent, and remember that these items come from the English tradition. So this wouldn't work for everybody in the world, but for people of English and European heritage, it works. So take a look. Does anybody have a mole on your wrist or your hand somewhere? I do. We got a couple. Yes, mole, wrist, hand, couple. All right. Here is what the Book of Fate says about you. Shows the person to be of an ingenious and industrious turn, faithful in his engagements, amorous and constant in his affections, rather of a saving disposition, with a great degree of sobriety and regularity in his dealings. It foreshadows a comfortable acquisition of fortune, with a good partner and beautiful children. But some disagreeable circumstance will happen about the age of 30, which will continue 4 or 5 years. In a man, it denotes being twice married. In a woman, only once, but that she will survive her husband. I should probably tell my husband that, because I have a mole right there. Make sure he's got a good will written out. All right, so then the second one, in case you were left out there, does anybody have a mole between your elbow and your wrist? So somewhere on your forearm. Actually, I do here also. Yeah? All right, so this shows a placid and cheerful disposition, industry, and a love of reading, particularly books of science. It foretells much prosperity and happiness towards the middle of life, but after having undergone many hardships, if not imprisonment. It also denotes that your eldest son will rise to honors in the state and marry a woman not of his own country who will bring him much riches. So there you are. How is that for specific for you? So there's sort of a handful of kind of miscellaneous methods of fortune telling in these books. This book, for example, includes a table, the fortune table. Now, in this particular branch, you stick a pin. So you're supposed to put a piece of paper over the top of this page, and then you stick a pin randomly through the paper, and then there's meanings that correspond to A1, B2, etc. That then you look up in the book, and so that's why there's all those little marks on there. Those are the marks from the pin. This was used. So somebody tried this several times with different pins. So then, all this brings us around to kind of the main question, which is, what did they want to know? What can we learn about these people from all these things that they're asking? And so there were several topics emerge. If you look at all these different methods and what the questions and answers would be, several themes emerge. The major one, as we've already seen, being marriage. Love and marriage, definitely the biggest. It's assumed that the people who are getting these having their fortunes told are generally young unmarried women, and at this time, everyone but women in particular were expected to get married. If you didn't get married, you were an old maid, and that was a terrible thing. So you had to get married, and the law was pretty well stacked against women at this time, so that their choice of marriage partner had a huge impact on their quality of life. So this was a subject of very burning importance to any young woman, and with good reason. So one interesting gendered difference emerges, though, because when women were asking the question of, oh, will I get married? Will the man I love, will I end up getting him? Those questions tended towards, am I going to get married? Will he be a rich man? Will we have a lot of children? It's more of, am I going to get married? And if so, to what kind of person? With men, the questions tended more towards, will my bride be a virgin? That was really apparently the main question that the guys wanted to know. So having children was also very important at this time. So a lot of the questions tended toward, am I going to have children? If so, how many? What's going to happen to them? We saw that with the moles, that your eldest son is going to marry someone who will bring him wealth. Those were the kinds of things that people wanted to know. A lot of the topics are fairly universal, like wealth, the acquisition of wealth. A lot of people wanted to know, is my business going to succeed? Not really any different from something you would wonder about today. But then some of them indicate a bit of a difference in how times have changed. So travel, for example. I grabbed a ship over here. So this is before cell phones, obviously, before instant communication. And so it might have been months since the ship set sail, and you do not know if your loved one is alive or dead. And so people would consult a fortune teller. Are my loved ones alive? Has my ship made it to port? Is it what's the most auspicious day to set sail on? So these were the kinds of things people worried about, because they still cared about their business and about the people in their lives. They just didn't have as many methods as we do of finding this information out. Another one that's, fairly similar to today, but indicates a difference in degree, is that of health, sickness, and death. So obviously people still get sick now, but we have improved ways of dealing with it now. Better diagnostics, better treatments, and so a couple hundred years ago, your prognosis was not as great if you did get sick, and so there is rather an urgency to the questions about health and about recovery at this time period. And then one that at least I have not really heard of being of pressing concern today, but definitely was at this time period, was in finding lost or stolen goods. All right, so people misplace their keys, etc. That's maybe the closest analogy here, but it does speak to the greater value of material possessions at this time. We're talking about an era before the Industrial Revolution, and so just about every object you owned represented a fairly significant percentage of your income. And so if you lost it, you'd be very concerned about getting it back. And so a lot of people consulted fortune tellers about getting back stolen goods and about theft too. I don't know. It seems to be either people were paranoid about it, or there really was a lot more thievery going on at that time. So this for me is a very interesting topic. I love to see how people are using the occult to navigate their world, and what it says about them versus what it says about us. And I have put this to the test by portraying an 18th century fortune teller at various events as Mrs. Voyance. Did anyone figure out my first name? You must have the second sight yourself. Yes, indeed, Claire. So it's definitely a fascinating study, and I would be happy to take any questions.